one small church in our area. They still, every Thursday night, they meet for an hour, and it's basically community time, and anyone can show up. And it's just really like basically people talking about how they're doing and share a few prayer requests. And sometimes, they bring out, here's my new puppy. And sometimes like, oh, this is what my grandchild did. And they sent me this picture. But the idea is kind of using that technology for community building. And they found, while they still do stream their services, that was the most that's when they got the most people online at the same time. So I think, thinking through kind of what is the theology and mission of your church? How can technology support that? That will cause a lot less stress, and also more people will be willing to get on board when you create those opportunities, rather than trying to push yourselves into a kind of a model. It's just because everybody else is doing. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to be speaking to you about some research that I've conducted, as Drew said, with the Lilly Endowment. And I've titled my talk, what is the future of technology in congregational worship? And even though a lot of churches have become somewhat instant experts over the last few years when it comes to technology, churches are still going through growing pains, because we think about models of church and liturgy that's been developed over hundreds of years being disrupted by the pandemic and the situations there. And churches are still trying to get their heads around, what do we do with this for the foreseeable future, and how might just this forced experiment that we've been part of for the last few years kind of begin to change how we see faith and how we see kind of worship in a congregational setting. So in the presentation today, briefly, I want to just cover three topics. One is I'm going to give an overview of my research on congregational use of technology and give you a little bit of background information on the research projects that I conducted. Then we're going to look at some of the highlights of key findings from the 3 research studies, and then the 5 tech reports that we produced for the Lilly Endowment on congregational use of technology. And then we're going to look at some questions about kind of, especially sitting in the space of 2024, where, what are the trends that we're seeing emerge, and what are the questions people asking about technology and their churches and congregations. So first off, like many people during February, March of 2020, I was, just, sitting on my computer. And I remember the beginning, the first Sunday of 2020, I logged onto my computer on a Sunday morning. I was actually overseas at the time in Germany. And, I saw the regular, maybe 6 or 7 friends of mine who have churches that were streaming their services mostly on Facebook at that time. And then 3 weeks later, I was shocked to see how many more churches were joining. In fact, it got to the point where there was literally dozens, if not 100 or more, of my friends or contacts that were streaming their church services on their Facebook platform. And so, as a kind of a researcher who studied kind of churches and religious communities' use of technology, I was really fascinated by this phenomena of how people were responding, and especially how technology got seen as the kind of answer to the problem of what do we do when we can't physically gather. So over the first 4 months of the pandemic, I, like a lot of people, developed new hobbies and new projects, and I produced a series of ebooks. The first one, The Distance Church, was looking at how churches, especially friends of mine that were pastors, how they were adapting to the use of technology in their churches and what kind of things they were learning. Religion in Quarantine was my second ebook that I produced, and that was bringing together people who study different religious traditions to talk about how their religious and faith communities were adopting and adapting technology, as well as how this was changing the way that they researched issues of religion and faith-based communities. And then finally, Digital Ecclesiology came out in the summer of 2020 as basically gathering a bunch of my friends who were theologians from all over the world and getting them to reflect on, how do we think, long-term about the ecclesiological implications of these technologies. And these books are all freely available, and I will give you a link to my website at the end of this presentation if you want to take a look at these. But it was through these kind of books that I was contacted by the Lilly Endowment. So the Lilly Endowment, through the Center for Congregations in Indianapolis, had early on in the pandemic seen that many churches were struggling or were going to struggle. And so they had distributed a sum of money where 2,700 churches in the state of Indiana were given a $5,000 kind of seed grant. Some people they just needed kind of to put Wi-Fi access in the church. Others, they had found they had like an outdated soundboard and they needed a more up-to-date soundboard that would connect with a new computer that they needed to buy. And then some groups were kind of even beginning to kind of launch into, well, do we pick Facebook? Do we pick YouTube? Do we pick Zoom for our streaming of our services? And so I was asked to kind of come alongside these churches and kind of follow them and collect some information from them and to find out, how this impacted them. And, as a researcher, to be able to kind of watch not just kind of one event, but see how this affected people over time was a really great opportunity. So the Tech in Churches project has basically is just wrapping up now in 2024. But we looked at kind of we did three main reports looking at first how pastors, especially the kind of challenges they were facing and how they were making choices about technology in 2020. In 2021, we were focused on how churches were kind of, had invested in technology, what they invested in, did it do what they thought it would do, and how they kind of came to the learning process that they went through, especially in the first kind of 18 months. And then by early 2023, we conducted a survey with those 2,700 congregations to see, okay, now that you've had 2.5 to 3 years of experience with technology, what have you learned and what are your new challenges that you're faced with? And so kind of, what I'm going to talk about is on those findings from those projects. But if you're interested in finding more about the in-depth about those different reports or our overall findings, you can look at techinchurches.org, where we have a website with all our material and all our articles and news coverage kind of documented right there. But just as a way to start, like in that kind of moment of 2020, when pastors and churches were kind of realizing we can't gather, the only option might be to do something technological. And many churches had either kind of consciously avoided technology or just it hadn't even come on their radar that technology in their worship services might even be something that would be helpful or useful. So there was a huge learning curve and a steep learning curve for many pastors and congregations, especially those smaller congregations that kind of, maybe have limited resources and maybe the pastor, doesn't even themselves have a tech background. And so, churches, as they began to kind of experiment with this technology, there was lots of slow starts and kind of, challenges and maybe some mistakes that were made. But churches also began to see that there's an opportunity here, an opportunity for not just connecting their local congregation, but, as I was hearing before the talk, people that had maybe moved away to, and physically separated from their congregation and other faith community were able to reconnect in new ways. People that maybe had kind of left their community for other reasons were feeling the need to come back, and technology allowing them to do that. So we see the pandemic, and especially this period between 2020 and 2023, this time of unique opportunities and innovations, but also this kind of stressful time because of the kind of learning curve that was required of technology for many religious leaders. And so I want to move now into kind of highlighting some of the key kind of moments and key kind of findings that we found during our journey of studying these churches. And again, there was three main reports that we put out. The first one was about when pastors put on the tech hat, that first year of how they adapted and made choices about technology. The second report was kind of looking at that, 21 to 22, okay, people are getting more comfortable. How do we kind of see technology? Is it just about getting our services online, or people beginning to experiment with something else? And then the third report, We're Still Here, is how community continues to play a visible part in 2023 into 2024 for many churches. So one of the first kind of, I think the points of resistance or why churches were a little bit hesitant to pick up technology was the idea that, just the idea that, going online and build and trying to do something that looked like church just didn't feel right. It felt like, we're doing church, but it's missing that true community feeling. And for many congregations, the whole idea of doing worship in a mediated way was very conflictual. In some ways, they kind of said, well, this is the only option we have, but it just doesn't feel natural, or it doesn't feel normal, or it doesn't feel like it sits even well with our kind of theological identity and our worship experiences. So we saw a lot of kind of what I call technologically hesitant people. So these are people who basically have had some kind of technology skills or kind of exposure, but they didn't feel like they were experts. And so the moving of their services online made them feel really unsettled and uncomfortable with this change. And then there was even some churches and people in congregations that were actually technologically resistant, who consciously kind of pushed against using technology. But we saw that, this conflictual kind of situation showed that kind of people's understanding of not just what it can be used for, but just how people's understanding of what it means to be part of a church, what a religious community and faith community should be, was something that we thought we all agreed on the same definition, but new definitions and new understandings emerged. Also, really on in the early days is that many pastors, realized we don't have the tech equipment, and I don't have the tech experience to even know how to get started. So these new tech teams and seeing the tech team as kind of a part of a ministry of a church became a real kind of innovation that many churches had to grasp and adapt to. A lot of kind of older volunteers who had been maybe part of the kind of tea making or coffee making kind of service were then recruited into these new spaces of using technology. A lot of times it was the youth pastor or members of the youth group that were working alongside these older volunteers to help. But we saw kind of, again, a real peak in 2020 and 2021 of people willing to experiment and do anything to keep services going. But very quickly, because of the how long the pandemic rolled on for, really quick burnout, which is continued and continues to be a challenge for some churches. So, kind of at the heart of this issue in the early days was, how the online experience raised questions about what does it mean to be a church? For example, what are the limits of altering religious rituals and religious liturgy? For some religious traditions, the idea of communion or the Eucharist, moving that online was a huge challenging area. For some groups, the idea of doing communion through the screen was not that problematic because their theology allowed for a lot of flexibility in kind of how they saw what the purpose of the symbolism of communion and the theological significance. But for other groups, especially kind of Anglo-Catholics, this was a huge debate area. And even for groups like the Methodist Church kind of coming out saying, hey, there's some religious rituals we can't do online or can't legitimate online, and communion is one of them. And another issue that was about how do we see church is that, for most people, they would say that, what is church? Well, it's the community and the relationships. But what they found out during the pandemic is that while that might have been their ideological definition, the true understanding of community was going to a certain place at a certain time with a certain group of people. So when you take away the place and you take away the space and you take away the people, can you actually have church? And so these are kind of debates that kind of early rise, and still things that scholars and theologians are trying to work out about how do we kind of make a new theological framework for these new traditions that we've introduced. Another really challenging point and that we found in our research was that most religious leaders and pastors and elders were not prepared for a lot of things in the pandemic. But when we asked them to kind of rank, what things like health and safety versus kind of technology, so, overwhelmingly they found tech to be the hardest area and the most uncomfortable area to kind of to adjust to. And that was because, for pastors, traditional pastors traits that people are trained for in seminary, things like, well, how to administrate finances and kind of run services, how to be a good, preacher or teacher, how to kind of counsel people in ways, and how to represent accountability and loyalty. these are traditional traits. But the kind of skills that pastors needed really out of the gate in the early days of the pandemic were things like resourcefulness and thinking about like how can I take this old equipment and add some patches and stuff like that to get it to work. How can I be willing to experiment and realize that maybe there's sometimes the online service is going to be clunky and the Wi-Fi is going to cut out and I'm going to by accident put a filter on and I'm going to have a weird hat on my head while I'm doing the preaching. So this experience of kind of that the traits that they were prepared for and the traits that they needed of being creative, experimenting, adaptable, caused a real area of tension. And in some ways that kind of tension just more exacerbated the whole idea of technology as being something an uncomfortable thing to have to deal with. And this repositioning also created a lot of uncertainty that got passed on then to the leadership team and other people doing the worship service. So there was kind of, again, many reported high sense of stress or just discomfort in just even trying to prepare the online worship services. So it shows that kind of, in this new era of technology, there may be new traits that need to be cultivated by pastors individually, but also kind of rethinking just the training that pastors need for a digital and especially an AI focused technological future. The third thing that we talked about, and I've mentioned this all before, that there were many people who we found were digitally hesitant and often are technologically hesitant. And these were often older members of the congregation that were not equipped with digital skills or maybe had some knowledge, but they definitely didn't feel comfortable, especially doing this on their own. But many of these people who are technologically hesitant, as churches kind of created new ways for them to kind of connect with their community, or kind of basically saw how getting technology to people was a pastoral concern as much as a kind of pragmatic concern. That technological hesitancy was kind of overcome in many cases. So, for example, some smaller churches I heard about would they would buy maybe a half dozen iPads, and then they would kind of have people from the youth group take those around to different people so that they could, if they couldn't see the services live, they would show them how they could log on and view a recorded version of the service. I heard other examples of churches kind of partnering, again, young people with older people in the congregation to help them kind of get adapted to how to set up my computer, how do I find that YouTube channel and get it bookmarked. And so we saw a lot of ways of kind of this technological hesitancy of kind of not being equipped with digital skills, but at least having some willingness to try to experiment with something that could be overcome. But one area that wasn't able to be overcome and that became a continuous stumbling block was what we found as digital resistance. And this was could be other people in the congregation, but especially pastors and religious leaders who were basically, they maybe had a little knowledge about technology, but they just didn't like it. And they also just didn't like the idea that we're having to change the liturgy of the order of we do things, the angles of how the pastor kind of navigates in the space because he's stuck to a screen like this and trying to be centered. And so this digital resistance was different in the fact that it was basically people were consciously pushing against the technology. They didn't like the experience it offered because it seemed to be somehow incomplete. They didn't like that they were having to change. And so we saw that this issue of the digital divide kind of surfaced in this way. And the digital divide is a word that kind of refers to how some people have do not have access to technologies or have knowledge about the technologies that they need, or have the kind of skills that they need to acquire. So many churches face a digital divide, but if their people were hesitant and willing to church, and the pastors and leaders were willing to be creative, that could be overcome. But digital resistance actually was where churches created their own stumbling blocks. And we see kind of, even in a post-pandemic era, this digital resistance is still kind of there in many kind of churches that are unwilling to kind of adapt to these new kind of technologies, or they rush to get back to face-to-face services as soon as they could so they could leave the offline behind. And it's just something I think interesting about just churches and they're willing to adopt and adapt to change in many, many respects. So, the last kind of thing that we found in our findings was just that this idea of navigating a worship in this digital space, that we found that this the online experience raised kind of theological and sociological questions that many churches didn't realize. Again, when they realized that, is the church, is it a building, a gathering event? Often the times the pastor would be able to spout out a great theological answer about what their church was or what the community was that they sought to cultivate. But at the end of the day, when they were forced online, they realized that their definition actually, in reality, was more about spaces, places, and events. And so this was a window for many congregations to kind of reevaluate what is our theology of community. How do we actually see people connected? And are the limits of technology or the opportunities of technology so because of our perspective or because the reality of the way technology allows us to connect? And so we also saw that there's a lot of practical and social limits to digital religion because of, kind of this willingness to adapt and be flexible. So the idea of kind of whether if a church was willing to kind of not just experiment with online services, but was willing to kind of see, well, maybe how can we do Sunday school in a new way, at least for this time of the pandemic? Or maybe we can move our Bible study groups or our outreach groups into online spaces like Zoom so people can keep meeting and talking together. So when they saw that that technology was not just an answer to a one-stop shop of getting the service online, but seeing digitally mediated options as something that could be more versatile, again, levels of fear and stress went down, levels of engagement went up, and and also we saw volunteerism going up as well, people getting less burnout with the digital experiment. So this leads me to the last bit of my presentation where I just want to talk about kind of where we're at now in 2024 and what are some of the issues we need to think about as we move toward an era where we've seen different shifts and changes in church and church attendance, as well as we've seen this continued kind of push toward more technologically mediated world and resources around us. So first of all, this kind of what we saw kind of tangentially in this kind of shift in understanding the community, we were able to quantify that in the survey that we did in 2023. So overall we saw, this first image is talking about how did your congregation view technology pre-pandemic? Well, many saw it as kind of connected or somewhat connected, but as we moved into the post-pandemic, we see that connected being integral or being essential, playing a much stronger role, i.e. people saw technology as not as working against religion or congregational life, but actually could be used as connected to part of ministering in a digital age. A second thing that we found is that, that the pandemic experience did alter people's kind of theology. And sometimes, again, it was kind of pastors having to come to terms with the reality of how they function as a community and their ideological kind of understanding what community was. And so we saw that, this move toward kind of allowing the pandemic to be a time of re-examining what their community is and what it could be, and also kind of more positively affiliated with technology as part of that. We saw definitely a growth in that area, with churches being more willing to kind of experiment and see that as a positive rather relationship between technology and the church or congregation. We also found that, in the report in 2023 and 4, that one of the biggest stumbling blocks for churches in their kind of tech use is their willingness to embrace change. So that, many churches had to change multiple times, whether it was the technologies they use, whether it was adapting to new levels of social distancing and constraint. But churches that were willing to embrace change, even when it was uncomfortable, were much more robust and much more positive in their engagement. And while we're still recovering from change fatigue, we're still in an era where change needs to be centered, and a change focus, or at least a positive willingness to engage with change as we kind of look at where newer technologies are pushing us, is something that churches are still having to grapple with. I think churches are also still grappling with, that the leaders needed these new kind of traits. The traits were more associated with what you would see as like an influencer or an entrepreneur than pastoral ministry. And so this kind of puts a spotlight on, what ministry looks like or what it needs to be in maybe the 21st century or moving into the 2020s, late 2020s and early 2030s, needs to kind of maybe adapt to more kind of skill-based or at least characteristics that embraces and helps churches prepare for change and gives leaders more levels of adaptability and creativity in using that. Because we saw that, that this uncomfortable repositioning of these skills created a lot of stress. And so if churches focused on the stress and the changes they need to make as far as how I have to reshape what what the service looks like and what we're all about, that focus was actually kind of detrimental to the well-being and the resilience of the church. And so churches, what we see is that instead of them kind of, just seeing technology as a stopgap for this time period, really need to look at how do we evaluate and integrate churches for the future. And not just kind of saying like, okay, churches need to have an online worship service option, but in what other ways might church life be invigorated or become more flexible by offering online options? Could there be small Bible studies or small groups that kind of are only online, and as a way to kind of offer for people who travel or have because of health issues can't meet face to face at all times. We also saw kind of a key thing coming out of the surveys was that people are beginning to question the sustainability of tech reliant ministry, because a lot of people said, oh well, we've invested a lot of time and resources, so we should be all set up. But the actuality is that technology keeps evolving, and many of those people, the cameras they bought, the web platforms they subscribe to, they may not be the ones that they need going on into 2025 and 2026. And so the idea of kind of seeing technology as a one-stop investment, it is problematic. And so this rethinking of how do we become a tech robust ministry and not just tech reliant in our use of resources and volunteers. So questions that churches are being asked. And so as a way to kind of sum up, I said, we're basically moving into this era where kind of hybrid / online worship is kind of not really optional for many churches. And that's partially because we've seen that, many congregations didn't have everyone come back after the pandemic. And offering those online or hybrid worship options allows people to have more opportunities to kind of integrate. So the idea of a hybrid church is something that people want. Many of those people, especially, are younger and robust, and people saw that actually young people came back to the church when online was an option. So rethinking about kind of our future worship as a hybrid kind of platform is important. And it's not just as an opportunity, but for some congregations, it might even be a survival strategy, especially in the face of kind of dwindling numbers, or kind of, again, the redistribution of people from multiple congregations into a single congregation. Also, what we see is that congregation and pastors, that need for skills and resources is still needed. So the idea about future generations of pastors needing tech training is something that seminaries are going to need to look at. Continuing education that with a tech component is something that many organizations or denominations are looking into to seeing how they can resource. And then how can they provide kind of, financially or kind of funding for kind of churches that will need to kind of stay abreast with technology. And also evaluating what is the tech we want versus what is the essential tech that's needed to keep basic kind of services and kind of programs running in that. And finally, we're in this era of, some people are describing as the post-Christian era. And a lot of the Pew statistics that have been shared in the last couple of years aren't very heartening, with kind of looking to a 40% decline or closure of some churches within the next 30 to 40 years. And, we've seen a definite shift. In 2020, the average size church in America was 85 people. In 2024, it's 63. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but anyone who knows who's been part of a small church, when you lose 5 people, you lose, that Sunday school teacher, that person that, was helping take the offering and count it afterwards. So with church attendance declining and Christianity being kind of in this change and disaffiliation kind of environment, we really need to kind of look at how churches can use technology in more ways and not less ways, and look at how they can use it in efficient and economical ways, and not just kind of what seemed to be the bells and whistles. And the key thing that came, another final key thing that came out of this research, is that we shouldn't be looking to the mega churches or the multi-site churches as a model for what church should be like technology wise. There will always be those few that kind of have exceptional technology platforms, but it's more about how can technology be a relationship builder and sustainer. Not just providing flashy videos and flashy, web experiences, but really how can technology be seen as part of the support structure and the communication structure of churches for the future to come. And so I wanted to say thank you to for those that who are here today. Thank you for those who are watching this video. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about my research. And if you'd like to get access to those digital books, if you look at Dr. Heidi Campbell .com, you can find access to those ebooks, as well as some other reports and free resources coming out of our research project. Or you can find those linked on the techinchurches.org website. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Heidi. And I shared in the chat a link for those of you that are watching with us live, so you can click on it and access her website. I want to move into a time of question and answer. And if I want to take the liberty of asking the first question, Heidi. Are there some kind of best practices, some kind of basic guidance that you would give pastors on how to go about the change that's in technology, and how to manage it, and how to avoid some of that frustration and hesitancy, or best practices that seem to kind of facilitate some of those things that those that were hesitant, the community aspects, the more of a sense of place, or things of that sort. What are some, and maybe it's just some examples of this church did this and it worked really, really well. What are some kind of guidance you can give us?
So one thing I think is that, pastors, especially in small churches, they feel like they have to do everything. But I think the churches that were able to recruit, whether it was a person in the youth group, whether it was somebody who didn't have a lot of tech background but was willing to learn, tech teams, tech partnerships, tech volunteering, I think is so important. And if a pastor at least is willing to kind of learn how the basics about technology, but is then able to empower a team of people to kind of then be the ones that are kind of looking over that technology, I think that's the best kind of situation. So trying to recruit volunteers, or kind of, especially, it's a great way to get young people who maybe have a real passion for technology interested and invested back in church. I think a second thing that is important is that a lot of times churches found kind of strained, or especially these kind of tech resistant people emerging when they were using technology in ways that kind of like challenge their theology. So, for example, again, if you are from coming from an Anglo-Catholic tradition and you believe in transubstantiation, doing communion online is never going to be an acceptable alternative for you. And rather than trying to push that through to your congregation, like what some of the Catholic churches and Methodist churches did, they introduced the idea of spiritual communion, where the worship leader would take, or the pastor would take communion on behalf of the congregation. Now, obviously, that's not going to be satisfactory, but thinking of innovative ways of thinking, okay, what is our theology, and how can we bring technology as a way to kind of support that, realizing there will be there is some things we can't do theologically or with technology to be comfortable. And so just because the church down the street is doing this, that doesn't mean you need to as well. Maybe, the best use of technology for your church is going to be kind of, again, using it to connect groups of people or kind of having meetings. I know one small church in our area, they still every Thursday night they meet for an hour, and it's basically community time and anyone can show up, and it's just really like basically people talking about how they're doing and share a few prayer requests. And sometimes, they bring out, here's my new puppy, and sometimes like, oh, this is what my grandchild did, and they sent me this picture. But the idea is kind of using that technology for community building. And they found, while they still do stream their services, that was the most kind of that's when they got the most people online at the same time. So I think, thinking through kind of what is the theology and mission of your church? How can technology support that? That will cause a lot less stress, and also more people will be willing to get on board when you create those opportunities, rather than trying to push yourselves into a kind of a model. It's just because everybody else is doing.
Right. That's really helpful. And it fits very much kind of our approach at Science for the Church. One of the big things we advocate for is for churches to find the STEM professionals, the science technology professionals, and invite them, partner with them. I know in many of the churches that I've been connected with since the pandemic, we're in the research triangle in North Carolina. There's lots of tech professionals, and there's a lot of churches that are very, very thankful to them because they set up and helped run the technology during the pandemic, and many continue to do so. So I really like that. And I like the contextual too, trying to know who you are and to figure out how the technology can support that. Thank you. What other questions do we have? Feel free. We're a small enough group here. Feel free to just unmute your mic, and you get kind of almost one-on-one attention from a leading expert here to answer your questions.
One question always comes up is, when I've been fortunate that I've been in several congregations where they know this really isn't an option. If they don't get on board this, they'll be left in the dust, which they felt they were in when COVID happened and they were scrambling to quickly learn all this stuff. So that's good, but they will often ask a question that I go, yeah, I don't know about that yet. They'll say, how, I mean, if church went, especially as they see churches closing left and right, if this becomes church, this is how you do church. How do pastors get paid? And I don't know about that yet. We're not there yet. But like, or you have to be somewhere. So even during COVID, we had some really cool green screen rooms set up. We worked on the lighting, we worked on all this stuff, and kids especially would get a kick out of it, and they'd say, "What's real?" And so at the end of the service, I'd shut the green screen part off so they could see maybe the Advent wreath was real when I lit that. Maybe the water that I was put, that was real. But the fact, if we use the outside picture or a part of the church picture, that was now gone. They thought that was kind of cool. But that took either we had some grant money that we could use, or people just chipped in and bought stuff. You still need the resources for things like that. So how are you seeing, if the future comes down to we're a lot of technology, how is it sustainable financially?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things with the issue of sustainability is again finding out what are the essential things a church needs. I.e., they need Wi-Fi access, they need some kind of recording device, they need some kind of platform and basics. But instead of we saw this during the pandemic. Like one church that maybe already had set up with a lot of digital space would let other pastors come in and record their sermon, so that they would then have maybe the recorded sermon, and then they would meet all in a chat room or something like that afterwards, on a Sunday. But I think the idea of partnership or creating partnerships, and especially like whether it's a local community of saying, hey, how could we pool our resources across denomination lines, or how could one denomination might create maybe toolkits that would be versatile and share around, rather than thinking I think that the day of the Lone Ranger church is gone. And churches, sometimes the pastor likes to be in charge of their little, kind of space. But I think, we have to see that the body of Christ is more diverse. And even if it's just a pragmatic thing of sharing basic digital resources, I think that's a good and positive thing.
Mm.
And I mean, obviously, what we're gonna see, new models of kind of the pastor, emerging. We've seen in the last decade, the kind of circuit rider model emerging for a lot of church congregations that have smaller churches as a way to kind of keep and sustain the local community, and so they don't have to close down. Yeah, I'm sure that there'd be a lot of denominations that move more toward like a tent making model, where pastors will be kind of bivocational and stuff like that, and which is obviously not ideal. But I think the church in many contexts, especially for unless if small churches and denominations don't rethink their strategies, then what we're going to happen is we're going to have mixed churches. There are going to be a handful of mega churches that people go to, and then there'll be nothing else. And I don't think that that's the best option for the future of the church. The church was meant to be local and in community and in relationship. So I think that was going to require, again, the creativity and rethinking.
Thank you.
Other questions? Christy or Eric or Ed?
Christy, thank you for all this. This is great. You're thinking way up here, which is great. Most of my stuff is down here in the weeds, and which platform to use, and what's the difference between a Zoom room and a host Zoom and that kind of stuff. I think one of the things I was saying, I saw you referring to researches, and I looked quickly at the website. Is the research that you were talking about available on not just the pamphlets?
The research, yeah, we have reports that basically for every we have 3 main reports, and they're like multi-page documents, and then there's also a kind of like a 2-page summary of each one, so you can get the highlights and see if I want to read more. There's 5 tech trend papers that look at different ideas in detail, like the issue of the digital divide, like pastors as digital entrepreneurs. And then we also created a resource instead of like trying to create resources for churches. What we've done is tried to collate them. So if you go into the resource section of our website, we try to say, here's a bunch of different kind of platforms that you can look at. Here's different events or kind of ministries that do training and offer free opportunities for that. So we're trying to see more like, kind of see what's out there already that we can offer to churches rather than kind of build things from the ground up.
And that's all in that same page.
Yeah, on
okay.
the techandchurches.org. Yeah.
I guess I needed a little tour of the library there. Thank you.
What other questions do folks have? I've got a big one, but it's going to change our direction a little bit that I want to ask before we wrap up here.
Mm. One of the things that the denomination that I serve was kind of bringing forward this as the pandemic was wrapping up and churches were returning to an in-person kind of format, was the need to not leave behind the use of online or digital ways to connect back to the church, because there were a number of congregants that never made it back into the pews. How do you balance that? How do you balance the need for technology, or better yet, how do you make or help congregations understand the need for a kind of a hybrid service as we go forward in this digital era?
Well, I kind of like to frame it in the terms of we live in this time of history where we've been gifted this technology. Now, this technology can be used for negative things, and we've seen that, but we also saw during the pandemic that it can be used for God's purposes. So why don't we kind of basically, in some ways you could make the argument it's bad stewardship to spend a lot of time getting all the skills, the training, the technology in place, and then just pushing it aside, because we're told to be wise stewards of what we're given for the kingdom of God. also, the fact that, there's some people for health issues or continuing health issues that can't come back. If you're saying that like we don't want to offer the online, or that online isn't really part of their congregation, is you're saying, well, there's a certain population of people that are never going to be part of the church just because they have some physical limitations. And so I think, like, again, whether it's offering, like maybe an online group option or Bible study for people that can't meet face to face, whether it's, because of illness or job schedule or commuting,
Sure.
or just the idea of, like, I've seen some churches that were good about, like, they would, the person who was running the tech board would kind of keep track of who's in the room, and they'd write down, and then the pastor would say, "Oh, thank you so and so for joining, and thank you so and so," and just really trying to consciously say, "Hey, you're in a different space, but you're still part of our community." And so I think that acknowledgement of just saying, if you're not in this space, you're not part of the church. That's a false dichotomy in many particular ways. And I think, kind of opening up our definition of what it means to be in community and what it means to be in fellowship with one another is important. And obviously, for some people, the online will always be less than, until we maybe get the full body suits that we can emerge in, and with 3D AI and stuff like that. But I think that there's, for many people, they're so grateful to have at least that option of online, if it's, between that and not being able to attend church or be part of a faith community.
Thank you.
Heidi, I had another question. When you mentioned Instagram, Zoom and Instagram is what the people under 45 tend to gravitate to. If, like, I have no experience with that, is there Instagram for Dummies book out there, or some sort of tutorial that how would you use Instagram for ministry?
Yeah. Well, Instagram it's kind of a hybrid between Facebook and TikTok. So TikTok is a platform focused on really short little videos. And Facebook is a streaming platform, so kind of large chunks. So you can do both on Instagram. And so Instagram is nice that, you can stream your service through Instagram, or what a lot of people do is they'll record it and then maybe break it down into like 3 or 4 little bites, and then put those as videos out there. And you, with some really cheap kind of apps and software, you can do kind of some basic editing online. And I would say that, I don't know that we have the tech in churches, if we have a Instagram for Dummies, but there's lots of kind of platforms out there. But the best thing is, like, find your child or your grandchild because they're on Instagram and they're on TikTok, and they will also tell you about the 3 other alternatives that are out there for that Gen Z is using. So
Yeah, and I've come across a couple churches that have blended the generations really well by getting the young people involved and helping to understand the technology, both as a way to kind of mentor in the faith and in service to the church young people, but also to meet the need of providing the technology that folks need. So I think there's really interesting ways that we can value our young people by making those connections. I want to throw a zinger out at the end, Heidi. It may be a question that's really hard to answer, but I know you've done some work on AI. How is AI and this rise going to impact churches gathering in worship, or will it in the foreseeable future? I know there's a lot of talk about the changes kind of culturally and in how we work in many spaces, and perhaps you have some line of sight on how it might impact our worship.
Well, I think, we're kind of in the right AI generation of the kind of generative AI right now, where basically it's more kind of text based and some images. But right now, what AI is really, really good for is kind of finding information, sharing information, and kind of finding ways to communicate information in a much more succinct way. So from whether it's kind of like pastors trying to find a good sermon illustration for a particular season or holiday, to kind of like, okay, what would be 5 different ways I could kind of explain this concept. So I think that I'm a firm believer in if you cite your sources, there's nothing wrong with using Chat GPT to help you, again, better frame or organize an outline, or to kind of deliver content or come up with ideas. Obviously then the challenge is going to be, is that sermon, did you actually write that sermon, or did you just get it off ChatGPT? And I think, again, ChatGPT, at least of the current generation, it's still I can always tell when students are, copying pasting from ChatGPT, because the language is just a little bit awkward, or they're using big words that I know they don't know what they mean. So I think it's kind of like seeing ChatGPT as like a helpmate or as a resource. And I know there also are, when we think of futuristic ways, the pastors as holograms is it's already happening in multi-site churches, where a pastor's one place, but then what you see, it looks like the pastor's right there, but he's actually a hologram at the other multi-sites. So in some ways, again, like just think if the Apostle Paul had the abilities of holograms to be able to preach the gospel. I think that they're, again, it's evaluating, like, okay, what is this technology good for? In what ways does it meet not just pragmatic needs, but kind of our goal and our vision? And then the things that kind of are problematic, like, okay, how do we put boundaries around them? And especially, I think pastors modeling good behavior with kind of citing sources such as ChatGPT, and thinking about the implications of, okay, whose content is getting used, because like I know a lot of my articles that are online, bits of them that now show up in ChatGPT. I never gave permission for that, but it's there. And so thinking about, we're living in an age where, it's more about kind of remixing and mashups. So realizing that, hey, that when you don't take ownership for things, that it's only partially yours.
Thank you. Eric.
First, an apology. Of course, you try to do this at church and then everybody comes in. So I got like 5 minutes, but of that, and I apologize. Appreciate your discussion here. One of the questions I have, I'm sort of obsessed with trust, organizational trust, all that good stuff. And as that seems to increasingly become the capital of our time, right? It's sort of even bigger and beyond money, right? That so much of the technology, the hurdles is all about trust, right? And so just thinking about even my own, so I'm in Hampton, Virginia, Southeast Virginia, which is sort of a purple, but sort of, I think, culturally conservative, just like slow, blue collar, like there's just not, they're not happy to adopt anything, no matter how progressive or conservative they are on anything. And so thinking about the ways in which trust comes, and trust is inculcated around some of these things. So like I'm thinking about AI, and it seems like the next question is not what AI does, but which AI and which ones are you trusting. So one of my questions was going to be, are you seeing any religious entities in North America creating their own AIs? So it's like, this is your trusted source to know like what the theology of Pastor Adam Hamilton would have to say to you, right? Because it's, ChatGPT is really good at telling you what internet Christianity has to say right now, right? And I found that's what it's good for, is tell me what did the crazies have to say about, the sacrifice of Isaac. Anyway, I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that kind of experimentation happen with any religious entities.
Yeah. Well, I know that there's an evangelical group that has developed a resource called Gloo, GLOO, and it really is supposed to be, it's a hub for kind of what are basically to talk about the ethical implications of AI, but also where can AI resources be used to help the church, and especially kind of smaller churches. So there are kind of platforms out there. I know I have a friend and a colleague in Germany, and he created Martin Luther GPT. So it's like you basically, he'll answer like in the in the corpus of Luther, what would he say about this issue? And that's just kind of a fun little experiment. But I think those can be like ways like incorporated into sermons, or trying to explain to people different kind of, especially dense theological concepts. So I mean, and I've heard another person's working on a Bonhoeffer GPT. I'm not sure if it's out yet. But so I think that there's a lot of ways, again, that we can use them if we think about, as a tool to kind of modernize and maybe clarify communication. It can be a really positive thing. But obviously, just issues of kind of, ownership, censorship, and are things. And I think another thing I would say about your comment is, unfortunately, pastors' profile and the level of trust for pastors in American culture is at an all-time low. It's below. Well, it's above used car salesmen, but it's below a lot of other things. So I think that but one thing people still have faith in is communities. So like, people, I mean, I know people that really pay attention to, on Google, what the rating of that church is and what the comments are and the feedback. So people will say like, okay, they're willing to forgive a pastor that they hold in suspicion if they know that church cares about them. So, I mean, focusing on, maybe, rather than the kind of, there's a lot of celebrityfication of the pastor in American culture. But if we can get back to focusing and using technology to develop resources of community and showing that is a place that cares, that's not just caring about those in the building, but actually has an outward focus. I think, those kind of things will then draw people to the church, and, where the pastor is just seen as part of the package, not the whole identity of the church.
Thank you, Heidi, for leading us in this conversation.
Thank you.